The night was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to your skin, dampening your resolve. Inside the abandoned warehouse, the hum of fluorescent lights barely pierced through the stale air. A group of children, ragged and huddled together, whispered in the dark corners of their cages. They had been here for weeks, some of them for months, waiting, praying for rescue. Among them were 5 white children, their faces pale with fear, their eyes wide with desperation. But in the corner, there was one who didn't fit the mold. A black boy, no older than 12, sat alone, his eyes hollow with the hopelessness that came from being left behind. The sound of boots hitting the cold concrete floor echoed through the warehouse, followed by the harsh buzz of a walkie-talkie. Special Agent Mark Riley, a seasoned FBI operative known for his sharp instincts, led a small team of agents through the dim corridors. They had been tracking this human trafficking ring for months. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. The team was ready to raid, to save the children no matter the cost. The children pressed their faces against the cold bars of their cages, hearing the distant voices of their captors as they rushed to hide, scrambling for weapons. But Riley had planned for this. His team was swift, efficient, and ruthless. With a sudden burst of gunfire, the warehouse became a battleground. Agents moved in from every direction, systematically neutralizing the guards. A few of the traffickers tried to flee, but Riley's team cut them off, expertly securing the area. The children were shaken, their eyes darting between the FBI agents as they worked to free them. Riley stepped forward, his cold blue eyes scanning the faces of the children one by one. The first cage he approached was filled with 2 blonde girls, no older than 10. He unlocked it swiftly, pushing the door open with a firm gesture. "Come on, get out of here," he said gruffly, his voice betraying no emotion. The girls hesitated, unsure of their safety. Riley's face remained expressionless as he gave them a reassuring nod. They stepped out, their movements shaky, their bodies bruised from weeks of captivity. But they were safe now. Riley moved on, methodically unlocking the other cages. The third one contained a boy with tousled brown hair, his eyes wild and wide. He scrambled to his feet, not even waiting for Riley to unlock the door fully. The boy looked up at Riley with gratitude, his lips trembling. "You're safe now, kid," Riley muttered, giving the boy a nod as he pushed him gently forward. But as Riley continued his mission, his eyes flicked over to the final cage in the far corner. There, sitting alone, was the black boy. His face was dirt-smeared and hollow, his body thin and weak from days without food. The boy looked up, his gaze meeting Riley's with a silent plea. For a moment, there was a shift in the air, an unspoken hesitation. Riley paused, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the boy. His breath hitched for a moment, a flash of discomfort crossing his features before he turned his attention back to the other children. The decision was made. "You stay," Riley said coldly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You don't belong here." The boy's eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief passing across his face as Riley turned and walked away. The remaining children were freed, ushered out of the warehouse, their faces filled with confusion and fear. As they were escorted to safety, Riley stood at the edge of the chaos, his jaw clenched tightly. His team had completed the mission, but something felt wrong. The boy's pleading eyes haunted him, but he shoved the feeling aside. He had made his choice, and there was no going back. Outside, the children were loaded into waiting vehicles, their faces still streaked with tears. It wasn't until they were safe at the nearby FBI headquarters that the truth would begin to surface. Among the children, one girl, around 8 years old, sat apart from the others. She was the first to speak up, her voice small but sharp with a sense of injustice. "Why did they leave him behind?" she asked, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her seat. "Why did they leave the black boy?" The room fell silent as the adults exchanged nervous glanced toward Riley. The tension was palpable. Riley stepped forward, his eyes hardening. "It's just the way it is," he said dismissively. "He deserved to stay there. That's where he's meant to be." The girl's eyes widened in disbelief, her lips quivering with anger and confusion. "He deserves to be there. Why?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "Just because he's black." Riley's cold gaze didn't waver. "That's the way things are. He wasn't meant to be saved." The room erupted in murmurs, the children exchanging shocked glances as the weight of Riley's words sank in. The agents who had been around him grew uncomfortable, the truth beginning to surface like poison in the air. But Riley stood unmoving, his expression frozen in a mask of indifference. The girl's sobs were the only sound in the room as she cried out for the boy who had been abandoned. Her words struck like a dagger, cutting through the hardened exterior of the agents present. And just like that, the seed of outrage had been planted. The news spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with posts, videos, and outraged messages condemning the actions of aged Riley. The young girl's words, "He deserves to be there. That's where he's meant to be," echoed in every corner of the internet, creating a tidal wave of fury that no one could ignore. The public was in an uproar, demanding answers, and soon enough, the media was all over the story. Headlines blared accusations of racism and selective justice within the FBI. The nation was divided, and the pressure was mounting for the authorities to respond. Within the FBI, the situation was becoming untenable. Riley was called in for an emergency meeting with the director and other high-ranking officials. The walls of the conference room felt like they were closing in on him as he sat at the long table, facing the stares of his superiors. The tension was palpable. Leaned forward, her fingers steepled on the table in front of her. "Agent Riley," she began, her voice icy, "you've caused a storm that we cannot ignore. The entire country is watching." Riley's jaw clenched. He had known this moment would come. He had expected it, in fact, but he never anticipated the storm that had brewed in the wake of his decision. He didn't regret it. In his mind, it was simple, practical even. But now, facing the director's unblinking stare, he was starting to question whether he had miscalculated. "I did what needed to be done," Riley replied, his voice flat. "The mission was about saving children. We saved the ones who mattered. The rest," he paused, his voice barely audible, "don't belong in our world." The director's eyes narrowed, and she exchanged a quick glance with the other officials present. There was a moment of heavy silence before she spoke again. She repeated coldly, "Do you mean the black child?" Riley didn't respond immediately. He could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was clear that this meeting would determine his future. But even then, a part of him remained resolute. He had always believed in the hierarchy, in the natural order of things. The boy had been nothing more than an unfortunate casualty of that order. He deserves to be there. That's where he's meant to be. The director's expression hardened. She took a deep breath, leaning back in her chair. The room was tense, waiting for her response. "Agent Riley," she said slowly, "you've just admitted to a blatant violation of the FBI's code of conduct. Not only is your behavior unethical, but it also goes against everything this agency stands for. You've jeopardized the mission and compromised the trust of the American people. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Riley's face remained expressionless, but inside, a knot began to form. The director's words struck him like a slap. He could feel the walls closing in, the reality of his situation sinking in. But he wasn't ready to back down. "Not yet. I did my job," he said, the words coming out harsher now. "I made the hard call. The rest doesn't matter." "The rest does matter, Riley," the director snapped, her voice cutting through the room. "What matters now is how we move forward. We have an investigation to deal with, and you will cooperate fully. You will answer for your actions." Riley remained silent, his mind racing. The director turned to another agent in the room, a younger man with a nervous look on his face. "Agent Dawson, I want you to handle the internal investigation. We need answers. Get to the bottom of this, and do it fast." Dawson nodded and quickly gathered his notes. He had been in the room when the children spoke out about Riley's behavior. and he knew just how much damage this incident had caused. His heart raced, his palms sweaty. He had never expected to be part of an investigation like this, especially not against a senior agent like Riley. As Dawson left the room, Riley was left alone with the director. She looked at him one last time, her gaze cold and resolute. "This is your last chance, Riley. If you don't cooperate, if you don't show some remorse for what you've done, you won't have a career to come back to. Do you understand?" Riley said nothing. He didn't need to. His mind was elsewhere, already focused on what lay ahead. He could already feel the weight of the investigation bearing down on him, the public outcry building in waves. But none of that mattered to him. What mattered was that he had made a decision, a choice, and he wasn't going to back away from it. Meanwhile, back in the FBI's safe house, the children who had been rescued sat in a small room, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. They had been separated from one another, each of them being interviewed by agents and investigators. But the young girl, the one who had spoken out against Riley's decision, couldn't stop thinking about the boy who had been left behind. Her heart ached as she remembered his sad eyes, the way he had looked at her before Riley walked away. She wanted to know why. Why had they left him behind? Was it because of the color of his skin? Was he any less deserving of rescue than the rest of them? Her mind raced as she waited for the interview to begin. She wanted to speak up again, to tell them what had happened, but she wasn't sure if anyone would listen. The adults in the room seemed to be avoiding the subject, as if it was too dangerous to discuss. But she knew the truth, and the more she thought about it, the more determined she became to make sure the boy wasn't forgotten. As the investigation into Agent Riley's actions gained momentum, the pressure on the FBI reached a boiling point. The media was relentless, with new stories breaking every day. Protesters began to gather outside the FBI headquarters, demanding justice for the black boy who had been left behind. The girl's words were now a rallying cry for the people who were calling for accountability. Social media campaigns sprung up, with hashtags like #JusticeForTheBoy and #RacistRiley spreading across platforms. Within the walls of the FBI, things were rapidly falling apart. Riley's future in the agency was in jeopardy, but he remained defiant. He was sure that he had done the right thing. After all, he had made a decision based on what he believed to be logical. But now, facing the fallout, he realized that his beliefs, his worldview, were being questioned by the very people he had once trusted. His colleagues were whispering behind his back, some of them eager to distance themselves from him, while others quietly supported his stance, though they didn't dare voice it publicly. Agent Dawson, tasked with leading the investigation, was struggling to maintain his composure. He had seen the footage of the children speaking out against Riley, and the more he looked at it, the more disgusted he felt. It wasn't just the child's testimony that haunted him, it was Riley's cold, unapologetic response. The boy, who had been abandoned in that dark corner of the warehouse, had become a symbol of everything wrong with Riley's actions. Dawson couldn't understand how someone who had sworn an oath to protect and serve could justify such cruelty. The investigation was complex, with agents from various departments combing through every aspect of the raid. The children's testimonies were key, but so were the body cams worn by the FBI agents during the mission. Riley's team had been thorough in executing the raid, but the footage from Riley's own body cam was particularly damning. It clearly showed him pausing at the cage where the black boy was held, a flicker of hesitation, followed by his decision to leave the child behind. The footage was hard to ignore. It was all there, the moment of choice, the cold indifference. Dawson spent hours reviewing the footage, unable to shake the image of the boy's face, the confusion and fear in his eyes. He knew what needed to be done, but the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Riley was a senior agent, a veteran with years of service. There were powerful people in the agency who would want to protect him, to shield him from the consequences of his actions. But Dawson was determined. This wasn't about protecting reputations or saving careers. This was about doing the right thing. As the investigation continued, the public's outrage grew. The Black community, in particular, was vocal in their condemnation of Riley's actions. Activists and civil rights organizations held rallies, calling for a full investigation into the FBI's practices. Their demands were clear. This was about more than just one agent. It was about a system that had allowed racism to fester unchecked. The young girl, who had first spoken out against Riley, became an unlikely hero in the media. Her story was picked up by news outlets. Her face splashed across headlines. She had become the voice of the voiceless, the child who had dared to speak truth to power. Interviews with her flooded the airwaves. "I just want to know why they left him," she said in one interview, her voice soft but resolute. "He was just like us. He didn't deserve to be left behind." Her words were powerful, resonating with people from all walks of life. The media caught on, and soon, her story became the focal point of the public's outcry. She had a name now, Mia Turner, and she was determined to find out the truth. At home, as the days passed, the storm around Agent Riley only grew more intense. The pressure from the media, the public, and the FBI was becoming unbearable. His actions had ignited a firestorm of anger and frustration, and now it was clear that he couldn't escape the consequences. His once certain world was unraveling, piece by piece. In the midst of it all, the young girl, Mia Turner, found herself thrust further into the spotlight. Her quiet plea for justice had turned into a full-scale movement, and now she was at the center of it all. She had become a symbol of courage, standing up for the abandoned boy and speaking out against the injustice she had witnessed. But the weight of her newfound fame was beginning to take a toll on her. Everywhere she went, she was followed by cameras and reporters. People wanted answers, and they wanted them from her. Mia didn't mind the attention. It was the cause that mattered to her. But as the days passed, the relentless questioning wore her down. "I just want to know why," she would repeat in interviews, her voice tired but resolute. "I want the truth. Why was he left behind? What made him less worthy of being saved?" But the truth was elusive. No one had an answer. The FBI remained tight-lipped about the investigation, and Agent Riley continued to refuse any apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. He was still holding firm to his beliefs, convinced that his decision had been justified. The country, however, was no longer buying it. The protests outside the FBI building had turned into a full-fledged movement, with activists from across the country converging on Washington, demanding justice for the Black boy who had been abandoned. The hashtag Justice for the Boy had taken on a life of its own, spreading like wildfire across social media. It wasn't just about one child. It was about systemic racism and the inequality that had long plagued the country. In the midst of this unrest, Riley found himself called to testify before Congress. It was a moment he had dreaded since the investigation began. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, a protector of the innocent. But now, he was about to face a body of lawmakers who would scrutinize every aspect of his actions, every choice he had made. The hearing was held in a large, imposing chamber, filled with rows of politicians and cameras. Riley sat at a long table in front of a panel of congressional leaders, his back straight and his face expressionless. He had been briefed on the questions he would face, but nothing could have prepared him for the firestorm that was about to unfold. Agent Riley began. Representative Jordan, a woman known for her sharp tongue and unwavering stance on civil rights, "You stand before us today accused of abandoning a child during a rescue operation, a child who, according to your own words, deserved to stay there." Riley stiffened, the words cutting through him like a blade. He had heard them before, but hearing them again in such a formal setting made them feel more like an accusation, more like a condemnation. "I didn't abandon anyone," he replied, his voice low but firm. "I made a call based on what I believed was necessary. Some kids are simply more valuable than others, The room fell silent. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Representative Jordan's eyes narrowed as she leaned forward in her chair. Valuable, she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. You're telling us that a child's worth is based on their skin color. That's what you're saying. Riley didn't respond immediately. He knew this was the point where everything would change. If he'd backed down now, if he showed any sign of remorse, it would all be over. But Riley didn't know how to show remorse. He had lived his life by a certain code, and in his mind, what he had done was right. It was logical. It was necessary. I made a decision, he said finally, his voice cold. A decision based on survival. The boy didn't belong with us. He didn't deserve to be saved. The room erupted in outrage. Representatives shouted, demanding answers, calling for Riley's immediate removal from the FBI. The cameras flashed as reporters scrambled to capture every moment of the hearing. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anger and disbelief. Mia, sitting at home with her parents, watched the hearing on her television. Her heart pounded in her chest as she listened to Riley's words. Every time he spoke, it felt like a slap in the face. How could he say something like that? How could he be so cold, so dismissive of the boy's life? She turned to her mother, her eyes filled with determination. I'm going to make sure he pays for this. He can't get away with it. He can't just throw a child's life away because of the color of their skin. Her mother nodded, but there was a look of concern in her eyes. Be careful, Mia. This isn't going to be easy. You're up against someone with a lot of power. But Mia was resolute. She knew that what Riley had done was wrong, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. She had already spoken out. She had already demanded the truth. Now, it was time to take it to the next level. The next few days were a blur of interviews, protests, and media coverage. Mia's voice continued to echo across the country, her calls for justice growing louder with every passing moment. She was no longer just a child who had witnessed something terrible. She had become a leader in the fight for justice, and the country was listening. The investigation into Riley's actions was intensifying. Dawson, still working tirelessly on the case, had uncovered new evidence details from the raid that had been overlooked at first. Riley's body cam footage had been thoroughly examined, and there were discrepancies in his report. He had failed to document the moment when he had left the black boy behind, and his justification for the decision had been inconsistent with the facts. The walls were closing in around Riley, but he still refused to acknowledge the truth. He was convinced that he had made the right choice, and no amount of evidence could change that. But the investigation was far from over, and Mia, with her unwavering determination, was only just getting started. The atmosphere in Washington was tense as the investigation into Agent Riley's actions reached its boiling point. The public's anger had reached a fever pitch, and protests were happening every day, with thousands of people flooding the streets, demanding justice for the boy Riley had abandoned. The pressure on the FBI and the government was becoming unbearable, and Riley found himself in the eye of a storm he could no longer control. The congressional hearing had been a tipping point. Riley had been forced to defend his actions before a panel of lawmakers who were not willing to let him off the hook. His cold indifference had only fanned the flames of outrage. It seemed that every day new revelations were coming to light, further damaging his reputation. The more the public learned about the way he had treated the black child, the more disgusted they became. Mia Turner, the young girl who had spoken out against him, had become a symbol of hope for those who were tired of the systemic racism that had plagued their country for generations. But while the nation was turning its attention to Riley's actions, Mia was growing restless. She had watched the hearings on television, her anger bubbling over as she heard Riley speak with such cold detachment. She could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on her, and she knew that she couldn't stop until she had exposed Riley for who he truly was. She was no longer just an innocent bystander. She had become a key player in this fight, and she wasn't going to back down. She spent her days going over the details of the raid, combing through news reports and speaking with activists who had been on the ground. The more she learned, the more determined she became. She wasn't just fighting for the boy who had been abandoned. She was fighting for a cause that was much bigger than any one person. She was fighting against a system that had allowed racism to thrive unchecked. A system that had allowed people like Agent Riley to hold positions of power. Her parents, though supportive, were concerned. They had seen how much Mia had been affected by everything that had happened, how deeply she felt the weight of the injustice. But Mia wasn't afraid. She had been given a platform, and she wasn't going to waste it. "Are you sure you want to do this?" her father asked one evening, his voice filled with worry. "This isn't going to be easy, Mia. People are angry, and not just at Riley, they're angry at everyone who has allowed things like this to continue." Mia nodded firmly. "I know, Dad, but this is bigger than me. It's bigger than anyone. I have to do this. I have to make sure that something like this never happens again." Meanwhile, Riley's world continued to crumble. The FBI had placed him on administrative leave, but that was only the beginning of the fallout. His colleagues had turned their backs on him, some offering quiet support, but most distancing themselves. As the investigation deepened, the agency had begun to reassess its internal practices, scrutinizing every agent's actions in light of the public outrage. Riley had become a pariah in the organization, and even those who had once considered him a friend now saw him as a liability. The mounting pressure had begun to take its toll on Riley's mental state. For the first time in his life, he began to question everything he had believed in. He had always been so certain, so steadfast in his views. But now, with the entire country watching, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was losing control. He had never been one to back down. But as the investigation intensified, it became harder to ignore the overwhelming weight of the evidence. One evening, while sitting in his apartment, Riley watched as the news broadcast yet another story about the protests. This time, the camera focused on a young boy, no older than 8, holding up a sign that read, "We are all equal." Riley's gaze lingered on the child's face, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind. Was this all a mistake? Was he truly right in what he had done? His phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was a message from an anonymous source, someone from within the FBI, who had information about the raid. The message was cryptic, but it hinted at something that Riley had not considered before. It seemed that there were those within the agency who had seen the full scope of what had happened during the rescue operation, and now they were ready to speak out. Riley didn't know what to think. He had spent so many years believing in the system, trusting the agency, that the idea of someone from within turning on him felt like a betrayal. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it might be his only chance to save himself. If he could get ahead of the story, spin the narrative to his advantage, he might be able to salvage his career. But deep down, Riley knew that it was too late. The public had already made up their minds. His actions, his refusal to acknowledge the truth, had sealed his fate. Mia, on the other hand, was becoming more powerful with each passing day. She had been invited to speak at rallies, sharing her story and demanding justice. The media was hanging on her every word. The hashtags she had once seen as simple rallying cries had now become national movements, with people from all walks of life joining in the fight for justice. What had started as a single voice had become a chorus, and Mia had become the symbol of that fight. Her parents, still concerned, had seen how much Mia had grown throughout the process. She was no longer just a child speaking out against an injustice. She had become a force of nature, and afraid to speak truth to power. Her interviews, her speeches, her unwavering determination had earned her respect from people across the country. And then, one day, Mia received a letter. The letter was from the boy who had been left behind. His name was Jamal, and he had managed to escape the human trafficking ring in the days following the raid. He had been too young to fully understand the significance of what had happened, but as he grew older, he realized that his life had been marked by something far darker than he had known. The letter was his way of thanking Mia for speaking up, for giving him a voice when he had none. "I don't know where I would be today if it weren't for you," the letter read. "You gave me the courage to speak out, and now I'm free. Thank you for everything." Mia held the letter in her hands, feeling a mixture of emotions. She was grateful for Jamal's words, but the anger she felt toward Riley, toward the system that had allowed him to make that decision, was still burning inside her. She wasn't finished yet. She couldn't be. The fight was far from over. The investigation, the public outcry, and the movement for justice were all building toward a climax. Mia was at the heart of it, and she knew that this battle was one she couldn't back away from now. The final chapter of the story was quickly approaching. The investigation into Agent Riley had reached its peak, and the country was watching closely as the days ticked down to the inevitable conclusion. Mia Turner, who had once been a quiet girl affected by the trauma of the raid, was now a determined leader of a movement that demanded justice. The pressure was mounting, and the tension in the air was palpable. Riley, who had once walked with unwavering confidence, now found himself on the verge of complete collapse. The FBI had already made its decision, despite the mounting evidence of Riley's racist behavior and the outrage that had consumed the nation. The agency had announced that they would not immediately terminate him, citing the need for further investigation. But that didn't sit well with the public, nor with Mia, who knew that the truth had already been laid bare for all to see. On the day of the final hearing, the atmosphere was electric. Thousands had gathered outside the courthouse, rallying for Jamal, for the children left behind, and for the countless others who had suffered because of the systemic racism that had pervaded the FBI and law enforcement for years. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the building. As the world waited for what would come next, Mia stood with her parents near the front of the crowd, her eyes focused on the courthouse steps. She felt the weight of everything that had happened, the fear, the anger, the grief, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. She had seen the injustice. She had spoken out, and now it was time for the world to listen. Inside the courtroom, Agent Riley sat at the defendant's table, his once pristine uniform now a symbol of his downfall. He was a broken man, his face drawn and pale, his eyes hollow. He had been dragged through the mud, publicly humiliated for his actions, but he still refused to acknowledge the full extent of his wrongdoing. He still clung to the belief that he had done the right thing, that his decision had been justified. His arrogance had been his greatest weakness. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, entered the courtroom and took her seat. The room fell silent as she glanced over the proceedings before her, her eyes narrowing slightly as she prepared to speak. "Agent Riley," she began, her voice steady and commanding, "you stand here today accused of an unforgivable betrayal, not just of your oath as an FBI agent, but of the very values this country claims to hold dear. The lives of children were entrusted to your care, and yet you chose to abandon one simply because of the color of his skin." Riley sat motionless, his hands folded in front of him. He refused to look up, knowing that his every move was being scrutinized by the eyes of the nation. "You have been given every opportunity to make amends," the judge continued, her voice unwavering, "and yet you have failed to take responsibility for your actions. Your refusal to apologize, your refusal to acknowledge the harm you caused, has only deepened the wound you inflicted on this country." Mia had been invited to speak during the hearing, and now it was her moment. She took the stand, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never imagined that she would find herself here, in this place, speaking for a cause much larger than herself. But she had seen the pain in Jamal's eyes. She had seen the fear in the eyes of every child who had been left behind, forgotten by those sworn to protect them. And now, it was her time to make the truth known. Mia Turner, The judge addressed her. You have been a voice for the voiceless. Please, tell us what you feel needs to be said. Mia stood tall, her voice strong and clear. I was there. I saw it. I saw how she turned her gaze toward Riley. How you left that boy behind. I saw how you chose who was worthy of being saved and who wasn't, and you made that decision because of the color of his skin. I want you to hear me, Agent Riley. That boy, his name is Jamal. He was just as worthy of being saved as any of the children you took, but you made him a target simply because of who he was. The courtroom was silent as Mia's words echoed through the room. Every person in the gallery seemed to be holding their breath. Riley's eyes flickered for the briefest of moments, and for the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in them. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it had appeared. He wasn't ready to face the truth. Mia continued, undeterred. What you did wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate, and it was wrong. You abandoned a child who was in desperate need of help, and you did it because of who he was, because of his skin color. You can try to justify it, but you can't erase the truth. We all saw it. We all know what you did. Riley's face twisted in anger as he stood up, ready to protest, but the judge silenced him with a single gesture. Mia's words had cut through the room like a blade, and there was no room for his defense anymore. The truth had been spoken. The public had already made their decision, and Riley was no longer in control of his fate. As Mia stepped down from the stand, a wave of applause erupted from the gallery. She had done what so many had only dreamed of. She had stood up for what was right, and now the world would never forget her courage. The decision was handed down swiftly. Riley was stripped of his position as an FBI agent and charged with criminal misconduct for his actions during the raid. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for was shattered beyond repair. The public's demands for justice had been heard, and now the consequences of his actions would be felt. As the courtroom cleared, Mia found herself surrounded by reporters, her name now known across the country. She had become the face of a movement that demanded equality, justice, and accountability. The fight wasn't over, but this victory was a start. Mia smiled to herself as she looked out at the world that had changed because of her. She had fought for the boy who had been left behind, for the children who had been forgotten, and she had won. But the work was far from done. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to expose, and Mia Turner, once just a young girl in the crowd, was ready to lead the way. The world was watching, and Mia would make sure they never stopped listening. The storm raged outside, a cold wind tearing through the trees as rain lashed against the windows. Inside, it was quiet, almost too quiet. Mia Turner sat on the edge of a couch in her family's small living room, staring at the television, but her mind was far away. The court hearing was over, Riley's fate sealed, and the world had heard her voice. But despite the overwhelming sense of victory that had flooded the nation, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more she needed to do. She had fought so hard for justice, for the truth to be known, yet Jamal's face still haunted her. She couldn't forget the boy who had been left behind, the child whose life had been ignored because of the color of his skin. The news was playing a story about the aftermath of the hearings, but Mia barely noticed it. Her phone buzzed suddenly, pulling her out of her thoughts. She looked down and saw an unfamiliar number. Without thinking, she answered it. Mia Turner. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but there was something urgent in the tone. Yes, this is Mia. Who's this? She asked, her pulse quickening. This is Officer Harris, with the local police department. The voice continued. I need you to come to the station. Mia, we've found him. We've found Jamal. Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. She stood up so quickly that the room swam around her. Jamal? He's alive. She stammered, disbelief thick in her voice. Yes, he's alive, Officer Harris confirmed. We managed to trace the human trafficking ring back to a remote location. Jamal was one of the children still trapped there. We got to him just in time. He's safe now. But, Mia, he needs you. Mia didn't need to hear anything else. She grabbed her jacket and rushed out of the door, the rain soaking her within seconds. Her thoughts raced as she made her way to the police station, the weight of the news finally settling in. Jamal, the boy she had fought for, was finally free. She couldn't imagine what he must have been through, the trauma he'd endured, yet here he was alive. When she arrived, she was led to a small room, where Jamal sat quietly in a chair, his head bowed. He looked much younger than she remembered, his once bright eyes now darkened with the weight of the years he had spent in that hellish place. His clothes were ragged, his face streaked with dirt, but it was him, the boy she had spoken for, the child whose cries had been ignored by Agent Riley. As Mia approached, she couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in her chest. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, it felt almost too much to bear. Jamal slowly looked up at her, and their eyes locked. There was a moment of silence, and then Jamal's eyes filled with tears, as if he had been holding it all in for so long that he couldn't keep it in anymore. He reached out for her, and Mia didn't hesitate. She rushed to his side, wrapping her arms around him as he collapsed into her embrace, his small body trembling. "I thought you'd forgotten about me," he whispered, his voice barely audible, thick with emotion. "I thought you didn't care." Mia's heart shattered as she held him tighter, her own tears streaming down her face. "I never forgot you, Jamal. I swear to you I never did. I fought for you every single day, and now you're safe." The words didn't feel like enough. They didn't seem to capture the enormity of what had happened, the pain Jamal had suffered, or the relief that flooded through her now that he was finally out of that nightmare. But they were all she had. Jamal pulled back slightly to look at her, his small hands gripping hers. You didn't give up on me. You didn't let them forget." Mia nodded, unable to speak at first. Her throat was tight, the weight of everything pressing down on her. I couldn't let them forget you, Jamal. You matter. You're worth so much more than they ever saw." The officer, who had led them to Jamal, stood quietly by the door, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of respect and sadness in his eyes. He knew the boy had suffered beyond measure, but he also knew that Jamal was stronger than he appeared. He had made it out, and now he would have the chance to heal. As the moments passed, Jamal's tears began to subside, though his face still held the traces of fear and pain. But there was something else there, too, a glimmer of hope. He was alive, he was free, and though the road ahead would be long and filled with healing, there was a chance now, a chance for a future he had almost lost. "I'm scared," Jamal admitted quietly, his voice trembling. "I don't know what happens now." Mia gently cupped his face in her hands, wiping away the last of his tears. "I know, Jamal, but I'll be here. You don't have to face it alone. We're going to help you through this, every step of the way. You're not alone anymore." The words hung in the air, a promise, a vow, that no matter what had happened in the past, the future would be different. Mia had fought for justice, not just for Jamal, but for all the children who had been stolen from their families, whose lives had been shattered by greed and hate. And now, Jamal would have a chance to rebuild his life. As the hours passed, Mia stayed with him, talking softly, trying to offer him comfort in the small ways she could. There was still so much healing to be done, so much pain to work through, but they would get there together. Jamal would get the help he needed, and with time, he would find peace again. When it was time for her to leave, Mia gave Jamal one last, tight hug. "I'll be back tomorrow. I'll never leave you." Jamal nodded, his tear-streaked face softening. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you."